Welcome, everyone. I'm Stephanie Rao, Executive Director at the National Council on Public History. I want to say thank you for joining us today for the 5th webinar in our 6-part series exploring the National Park Service's criteria for establishing World War II heritage cities. Over the last 2 weeks and into next week with our last presentation, we are exploring the criteria for purposes of applications and evaluation by Park Service staff from the author of our essay series on the topic. Today, we'll be hearing once again from Dr. Jon Taylor, this time on criteria 8, the presence of armed forces camps, bases, airfields, harbors, repair facilities, and other installations. A few housekeeping notes as we get started. Closed captions have been enabled. If you do not see them automatically, you can click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This webinar is also being recorded, both for those who cannot attend and for anyone who wishes to be able to review the content. We will email links to recordings of all 6 of these presentations to you next week following the conclusion of our last presentation. Please be sure to keep your microphones muted unless you have raised your hand to ask a question during the Q&A. And at any time, you can pop your questions for Dr. Taylor or for our colleagues in the Park Service into the chat area, and I will help facilitate that conversation at the end of Dr. Taylor's presentation. I also want to extend greetings from Dr. Turkaya Lowe, Deputy Federal Preservation Officer for the National Park Service, as well as Principal Historian managing the Park History Program. Dr. Lowe can't be with us today, but I know is really excited about this series of programs. I will also share a little background on the Heritage City Program that I know she would tell us about as well. Under Section 9007 of the John Dingell Act of 2019, the Secretary of the Interior may designate one city per state or territory as an American World War II heritage city. This designation recognizes and ensures the continued preservation and interpretation of the history of the United States home front in World War II. There are currently 18 jurisdictions designated as American World War II heritage cities. The criteria for designations are 1, contributions by that city or jurisdiction to the World War II home front effort, and 2, the city's achievements to preserve the history and legacy of those contributions to the war effort and to preserving World War II history as a whole. Within these 2 broad categories, there are actually 15 topics or areas in the war effort contributions and preservation and commemoration activities that are called out in the criteria. The National Park Service and my organization, the National Council on Public History, we're excited to partner with authors like Dr. Taylor to further explore these specific topics. We hope you're able to join us for the remaining webinar on Wednesday of next week. And for more information about the American World War II Heritage Cities Program, Kathleen Madigan has kindly provided those links in the Zoom chat here. And you can also send an email with specific questions to the NPS World War II Heritage Cities programs at aww2hc@nps.gov. And again, that email is in the Zoom chat as well. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Jon Taylor. Taylor served as historian and park ranger at Harry S. Truman National Historic Site from 1993 to 1998. He left the park to pursue a PhD in history at the University of Missouri-Columbia and graduated in 2004 and joined the history department at the University of Central Missouri in Warrensburg, located about 45 minutes to the east of Kansas City, where he has taught for the last 19 years. Taylor is the author of 4 books on the life, political career, and legacy of Harry Truman, including A President, a Church, and Trails West, Competing Histories and Independence, and Freedom to Serve, Truman, Civil Rights, and EO 9981. Taylor is currently working on a book about Harry Truman's Senate career. So thank you so much for joining us, and I will let you take it away.
Hi, Stephanie. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for everyone who's shown up and who will tune in later for this webinar. This one focuses on the training facilities. And in the essay that I wrote, I kind of focused on the facilities for the Army. In this presentation, we will focus, we'll take a look at those facilities for the Army, Navy, and the Marines. As we know, and as I've mentioned in previous webinars, historian David Kennedy noted that almost 16 million men, most of them conscripted, and 500,000 women, all volunteers, served in the United States Armed Forces during World War II. Between 1941 and 1945, 1 in 10 Americans served in the military. However, as we've also covered, the United States entry into the war, and when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, began well before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And so this focuses on the United States Army, the Navy, and the Marines, and looking at their construction of facilities well before December 7th, 1941, and continuing on up to the end of the Second World War in 1945. The key sources looking at the facilities that the Army constructed includes the first one here by Diana Wash, which kind of looks at kind of the development of, as I said, the Army facilities and what they called the history of 700 and 800 series kind of barracks construction. Now that's very focused. The book that's really a lot more encompassing is by Lenore Fine and Jesse Remington, the Corps of Engineers construction in the United States. In June of 1940, the War Department owned 2 million acres of land, but they estimated that the armed forces needed an additional 8 million acres to construct training facilities, 2.5 million acres for additional camps, firing ranges, hospitals, and depots, and 5.3 million for airfields and bombing ranges. 6 million acres came from the public domain, but a lot of the land was acquired through eminent domain. And if you're looking at the Army and their facilities and their construction, they were initially undertaken by the Army Quartermaster Corps from 1940 to 1941. The Corps of Engineers took over construction of the Army Air Corps facilities in November of 1940. So remember that the Army Air Corps was a part of the Army. And so there was a division that took place where the quartermaster continued to work on construction of camps, but the Corps for the Army, but the Corps of Engineers took over the construction of the Army Air Corps facilities. Now, in December of 1941, the Corps of Engineers assumed construction of most of all of the facilities that the Army utilized. The quartermaster still played an important role, but the Corps of Engineers became kind of more important. And the reason for this is that in the War Department, they believed that the quartermaster was not as essentially as efficient with the construction. And so this is why the Army Corps of Engineers took over construction in December of 1941. Now, prior to that transition in December of 1941, you can see that the quartermaster projects, looking at, and this again, we're just focused on the Army, appropriated $1.8 billion for camps and cantonments. You see reception centers, replacement training centers, and so it goes on and on. Looking at all of the kinds of projects that the quartermaster and then the Army Corps of Engineers took over. In this graphic, you can see, and this is prior to the Corps of Engineers taking over all of the projects at the end of 1941. You can see their work that they had done on the Air Corps stations, which was a significant amount of their work. This graphic here shows how the Army Corps of Engineers divided the United States up into different regions, and they would oversee the development of specific projects in those regions. Now, the Army started with the initial appropriations, certainly in 1940. We moved to the peacetime draft in September of 1940. And then you have Franklin Roosevelt essentially signing the executive order that federalizes some of the National Guard troops. And there was a real intense focus on just developing the camps that would begin to handle all of the increased numbers of Army enlistees. So, for example, in 1939, the strength of the Army was a little over 189,000. By 1945, that number was 8.2 million. So you had to construct these training camps to be able to increasingly train these individuals, but then provide all of the other essential requirements that they needed. The recreational facilities, obviously the barracks, training fields, churches. There were a whole host of buildings that the Army Corps of Engineers had to continue to build. So in the case of Fort Knox, it's not necessarily new construction, but they are beginning to build to accommodate these increased numbers. On the right-hand side of the page, or the slide here, you can see the individual laying kind of the electrical grid that would need to accommodate these increased numbers of troops and to supply electricity to the increasing number of buildings. Again, at Fort Knox, Kentucky, here's the tank training that those soldiers went through. At Fort Benning, you see expanding accommodations for increased infantry troops. Also, as a part of under the Army Corps of Engineers, and this is kind of in this transition period between the quartermaster and the Army Corps of Engineers taking over the overseeing the construction of the projects, you have new bases and new forts being established. In this case, you can see the establishment of Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri in 1941. And this is the entire size is of about 90,000 acres. And the construction of the fort is on probably maybe about 15,000 acres. And so this required significant numbers of workers to come in and actually construct all of the buildings that would need to support the increasing numbers of troops coming in. Fort Leonard Wood posed a kind of another challenge in the sense that the planners didn't really think how far a railroad was from the actual fort. And they had to construct 27 miles of a railroad to connect with the nearest railroad. And that was a little bit of a challenge in the construction and facilitation of the troops coming into Fort Leonard Wood was the lack of this railroad. So these are things that they had to, the Army Corps of Engineers and the quartermasters had to kind of overcome. This is a construction of kind of the building barracks at Camp Leonard Wood. And this kind of series of construction was built on they called it the 700 series model for the United States Army. And the barracks had a 125 person capacity or 125 persons kind of would be the max. The best accommodation would be probably for about 63 person barracks, and it would include a lavatory, mess hall, recreational building, and kind of a supply building. They would use indoor plumbing and central forced air heating. And this was something in the Selective Service Act in September of 1940 that specifically said that the folks that are going to be drafted, they are going to be able to have these kinds of accommodations. And so that was a real kind of a challenge for the quartermasters and the Army Corps of Engineers to be able to provide those kinds of accommodations. This is kind of what that 700 series building looks like finished. This happens to be at Camp Edwards in Bourne, Massachusetts. There was an 800 series model, and these were essentially designed to really not be permanent. But some research has suggested that the 800 series model, which followed, was a little bit more permanent. Habs Hair did a survey of a lot of these, a couple of military installations in the 1990s, and found several of the 700 and the 800 series buildings were still on the landscape. And they kind of concluded that the 800 series buildings fared a little bit better. Of course, these camps were segregated at Fort Leonard Wood. You can see the construction of the Black Officers Club. This was rehabilitated in 2018. So it's one of the few kind of existing clubs that is still on the landscape. And inside the club, it features a mural by African-American muralist. And at the time, he was in the United States military, Samuel County. And County was born in 1909. He had received a scholarship to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in 1934 and was drafted into the United States military, United States Army in 1942 as an engineer dump truck company. And that's essentially what Fort Leonard Wood housed. It was the 7th Corps, focused really on engineers. And so as an African-American engineer in the dump truck company, he also was a muralist, and he continued to paint African-American elites until he died in 1959. So Fort Leonard Wood, just to give you kind of a sense of some of the numbers, it had 1,537 permanent buildings, 250 temporary buildings. The number of board feet that it took to construct all of those buildings was about 73 million. And it also included 50,000 cubic yards of concrete. They constructed 56 miles of roads, and like I said, a 27-mile railroad way to the closest railroad. It had a sewage disposal plant that would serve a community of 56,000. And the peak numbers of personnel on the construction numbered 32,857. Now, the siting of these camps could definitely be controversial in a lot of different ways. One of the ways that you can see here in this slide has to do with the fact that the county where the military base was constructed, because they used so much of the county, they lost some of their valuation. There were individuals, about 4 communities in that area, about 15,000 acres, which were displaced. And so they had to leave. Some of the land was taken through eminent domain. Some of it, the individuals were compensated for. But one of the other issues was kind of the loss of the tax base. that happened because of the siting of some of these camps, or in this case, obviously the fort. And Fort Leavenworth was designed really to be permanent. And so that was an important element to its construction. A little bit different kind of siting of, in this case, it's classified as a camp and not a fort, was Camp Crowder. And Camp Crowder was established kind of in southwest Missouri near Neosho, and it became an Army Signal Corps installation training facility. And here you can see, and this is at the very beginning of the acquisition of the land that became Camp Crowder. You can see these are individuals who are being displaced. You can see the warning signs. This is United States government property, and you're not to enter it. And you can see, again, some of the challenges that folks faced if a camp was sited in your neighborhood. You could be displaced. The other kind of challenging situation in the construction of the camps initially is that you have workers that come in, and on the right-hand side of the slide, those are kind of these little very small buildings which accommodated the workers on the camp. You can see on the left-hand side, the Meadows Curve nightclub coming and establishing itself. And this is kind of while the camp was constructed. And so what's interesting is that these camps sometimes were not always well received. One of the newspapers in the area talked about some of these challenges. And this comes from one of the Neosho newspapers. Neosho has been one of the substantial towns of Missouri, just about the size of Lebanon. And Lebanon was an area near Fort Leonard Wood until boom times struck the places. Now, with the construction of Camp Crowder, only a few miles away, the population has doubled from 5,000 to 10,000. Rents have soared and prices gone up, and there is every evidence of a boom town, but many of the people do not like it. Mayor Glenn Woods is quoted as saying that Neosho did not ask for the project and did not need it. He said the city had grown naturally in 10 years by adding 1,000 inhabitants, and that 800 persons were engaged in industries and factories. The people are cooperating because they are patriotic, but they feel that there are evils as well as good resulting from the sudden boom. The mayor called attention to the fact that 600 or 700 families whose lands were taken for the camp may move out of the trade territory entirely, and this will have its effect. So again, some kind of challenges in terms of the location of the camp. Now, the camps do bring economic opportunities, but the initial kind of coming in, there were some significant challenges that the siting of these camps made. This is another kind of demonstrates the individual in this picture had been a farmer. And when the camp came, he essentially his farm had been taken. And instead of leaving the area, he decides to kind of work in providing some security for the development of the camp. And so in this case, you know, he is kind of benefiting economically from this transition. So so that's just the construction of the training camps. The United States Army Corps of Engineers also was responsible for the construction of the Army Air Force bases. This is just one example, but there were, you know, hundreds of these bases constructed across the United States and its territories and possessions. So they were responsible for those construction projects as well. Now, the bulk of this construction occurred really in 1942. And then when you trend towards the end of 1942 and into 1943, there becomes kind of a scarcity of resources. And so the United States Army, in order to continue to fulfill its obligation of training all of these increased numbers of troops, the ground troops, the Army Air Corps, and then those in the Army services, they turn to some kind of unconventional ways to house their airmen. In this case, the airmen here, the United States government purchased the Stevens Hotel in Chicago and established this exercise facility. And the United States did this, or the United States Army did this with a couple of other installations, buying some property or hotels in Georgia, Florida. And so this has to do with kind of the scarcity of resources that the Army ran into when trying to construct these camps or forts. They thought it was definitely more cost effective to actually acquire existing facilities. Now, this caught the attention of Congress, and there were some hearings over these kinds of acquisitions. But the United States Army did cite specific numbers that it was more cost effective to actually purchase these properties and then use them as training facilities. Here you can see in this graphic kind of the falling off of the projects for the United States Army, and specifically the projects that the Corps of Engineers was involved with. And like I said, that is because you kind of saturated the market, the competition for resources. And so the construction of the camps and facilities does begin to kind of taper off by 1943 and 1944. Now, in terms of looking at the United States Navy, in 1939, there were 125,000 members of the Navy. By 1945, that number had grown to 3.3 million. And so obviously, when you compare the Army and Navy, I mean, the resources that went into the construction of the facilities for the Army definitely supersede the Navy, but they're no less important. But one of the things that's kind of interesting is that for the United States Navy, the cost of these facilities actually goes up towards the end of the war. And some of this has to do with the fact that the United States Navy has to provide continual maintenance for the facilities that they are constructing in the United States and then in its territorial possessions. But then the United States Navy also becomes responsible for constructing various naval installations outside of the United States, the contiguous 48 and its possessions. And so the dollar figure for the United States Navy, even though it's smaller in comparison to the Army, it actually goes up. And you can see the trend line going up in terms of what it takes to support the United States Navy by 1945. So there's a couple of key sources looking at the training facilities, building the Navy's bases in World War II, history of the Bureau of Yards and Docks and the Civil Engineer Corps. Volume 1, Parts 1 and 2. Very comprehensive. And if you're looking for a specific installation, whether it be a training facility, air base, this is really the best source that I have found. One of the things when you're looking at the United States Navy, in July of 1940, Franklin Roosevelt requested 4,000 planes for the Navy and for it to, quote, to build up a Navy to meet any possible combination of hostile Navy forces, end quote. Now, the critical thing here is that in July of 1940, Franklin Roosevelt essentially calls on the United States Navy to have this two ocean navy. And so you had installations on the East Coast and certainly some on the West Coast. But you begin to see the ability for the Navy to staff a two ocean navy. Those resources go into the development of installations to do just that. So if it's training facilities, they have their own air bases as well, hospitals. I mean, all of those things. After that July 1940 call by Franklin Roosevelt, there's a board called the Greenslade Board, named after Admiral Greenslade, that looked into how can we create this two ocean navy. They make a report, and then they communicate that to Congress, and then Congress begins to appropriate money that will be able to do that. Now, most of the construction for these kinds of projects were carried out by the Navy Bureau of Yards and Docks, and they had their own civil engineering division, just kind of like the Army Corps of Engineers. And so they were tasked, this Navy Bureau of Yards and Docks and the civil engineers within it were tasked with creating this, all the installations needed for this two ocean navy. So the Greenslade plan was approved in May of 1941. And then you have the Secretary of the Navy begins to ask Congress for appropriations. Some of that is encapsulated in the first Supplemental National Defense Appropriation Act of 1942. But here's the thing, when you're trying to understand, when are various bases, installations, airfields, when do they get funding? This is a list of the appropriations for the United States, or that the United States Navy received from July of 40 up through September of 1945. And within all those appropriations, there's money that goes to the development of these training centers and bases and airfields. And so, like I said, it becomes kind of a challenge to unravel some of the history surrounding these installations, and it's usually tied to these appropriations. So the naval training centers, there were kind of like the United States Army. There were several that were already in existence prior to 1939, 1940. Newport, Rhode Island, Great Lakes, Illinois, Norfolk, Virginia, and San Diego, California. So these had already been established well before, kind of the push to create this two ocean navy. But these are the installations that begin to see significant funding to continue to develop all of the facilities that they needed. I mean, they just expand. You have a couple of important new facilities that come on board, and this is directly responding to the development of the two ocean navy: the Farragut Naval Training Station, the Bainbridge Naval Training Station out of Maryland, the Sampson Naval Training Station in New York. And so those are the three that really come on during the World War II period. Now, in the earlier installations, the United States Navy did have kind of a standard way in which they built their training centers. They called it a B1 design, H-shaped building that could accommodate 225 men. But these new training facilities were built a little bit differently in the sense that they accommodated larger numbers of folks. And you see in the Farragut, the Bainbridge, and the Sampson, facilities. They would accommodate 5,000 men units, and they were developed around a parade ground, had a drill field that embraced about 14 acres of flat, well-drained land. Adjoining the drill field were two of the largest structures, the drill hall and the mess hall. The drill hall was 625 feet long, 120 feet wide, provided nearly 2 acres of unobstructed floor area. In addition to serving as an indoor drill field in severe weather, it could also provide gymnasium facilities, a large swimming pool, removable stage, motion picture equipment. The mess hall was usually designed to use a cafeteria system, and it was large enough to feed 5,000 at each sitting. Living quarters for the men were provided by 22 two-story barracks. Each housed 228 men. Each building was equipped with its own heating plant and sanitary facilities. They could do their laundry, and then there were small auxiliary buildings with scrub decks, and 2 separate buildings were built to house the chief petty officers. Most training units had 2 dispensaries as well, and there were recreational facilities included bowling alleys, game rooms, and a library. Usually they had an administration building, a rifle range, small arms magazine, and a large storehouse. Completed most of these training 5,000 man training groups. And like I said, that applied to these newer training facilities. Here are 2 of them on the left-hand side. This kind of reflects the newer barracks construction at Bainbridge, the Great Lakes training facility in Illinois along the Great Lakes. That is kind of one of the new rec centers. Some naval facilities also included low-cost housing and constructed that. In some cases, it was a lot more difficult for members of the Navy to find housing, and the Navy owned and managed a lot of those housing projects on many of their other bases. Some specialized training units included the Seabees, and Camp Peary was established, which was near Williamsburg. And so the Seabees were the kind of the important or kind of specialized training units that would develop and construct any kind of installation that was needed in the war theater. So they were constructing things outside of the United States that the Navy personnel needed in battle. So they were CBs were active on D-Day, laying tracks along the shore in Normandy, France. So those are the kinds of things that they did, and so their training facilities were very important. You have the development of various naval yards, and in most cases, the Navy, I mean, they own these yards, and they had about 10,000 total ships probably during the Second World War. Some of them were government contracted naval yards, but these were not. They were owned by the Navy, and a lot of these naval yards, and I don't cover all of them, but just to kind of give you a sense of the East Coast ones, the New York Naval Yard, the one building there on the left-hand side is a 16-story kind of office complex with storage. The office complex has, part of it has the windows, and then the storage facility is just the solid concrete. And on the right-hand side, you can see the South Boston Naval Yard there. On the West Coast, you have the Mare Island in California, and on the left-hand side, or which is on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, San Diego Repair Base, for they could accommodate sub repairs on submarines at that particular base. So those were, again, important installations for the United States Navy. The other installations, and there are many, which I don't cover, but they're naval air bases, naval air stations. This one features the Naval Air Station in the territory of Hawaii. So those are just some additional, and these were much more prevalent across the United States, its territories and possessions. The Marine Corps, the key source, which does cover the development of the marine installations, is the same one that is used for kind of looking at the construction of the United States naval facilities. And if you looked at just kind of the numbers on the Marine Corps here, sorry, in 1939, about 18,000 Marines. By 1945, their numbers had grown to 474,680. And so they had their training facilities established early on at Quantico, Parris Island, South Carolina, and San Diego, California. There were 1940. This just shows kind of the trajectory of the increase of the number of Marines. Authorized increase in 1940 to 34,000. And at that point, it's divided into kind of two divisions, one on the East Coast, another on the West Coast, with the first division on the East Coast at the establishment of Camp Lejeune in December of 1942. It also accommodates the Women's Reserve of the Marine Corps by 1943. And the second division, the West Coast, Camp Elliott near San Diego, which later became Camp Pendleton and commissioned in September of 1942. So their training facilities, so on the left-hand side, Camp Pendleton, that's an early, or that's actually one that survived well into the 1990s. And then Camp Lejeune on the right-hand side, enlisted officers' quarters. The Marines had their own air bases as well. One of the important ones among many, the Cherry Point facility in North Carolina. So the significance. There are a couple of things to kind of remember. One author, John Daniel Hutchinson, noted that not everyone welcomed the military installations when they were established, and that he examined kind of the development of the military installations in the South and estimated that at least of those installations constructed in the South, about 50,000 people were displaced. And you can apply that to Missouri and the installations at Fort Leonard Wood and Camp Crowder as well. You see displacement of people. Some farmers in the South had to give up their farms. Hutchinson talks about Camp Butner, an infantry training facility that was established on 50,000 acres near Durham, where that happened. Folks were usually compensated for their loss, but they usually complained that they were not compensated enough. Hutchinson also noted that in that construction of the camp in Durham, North Carolina, he noted that an African-American church, which was in the path of the proposed installation, essentially was demolished and had its final service in April of 1942. So if the federal government did not use eminent domain to acquire the property, it sometimes offered to lease the land from owners. But sometimes those lease terms were not very good. Just outside of Little Rock, Arkansas, there was a group of individuals that organized the homeowners of the Camp Robinson Extension Area Association. And what they did was lobby the Arkansas state and federal politicians against extending the location of a camp there. Since the landowners did not cooperate with the leasing arrangement, the federal government seized the land, displaced about 1,400 people. Hutchinson concluded, quote, across the South, rural farmers and urban merchants repeatedly clashed over the establishment of military bases in their communities. Hutchinson also noted that African-American communities were disproportionately impacted. In North Carolina, Black residents were displaced from their lands to build Camp Lejeune, the Cherry Point Naval Air Station, and Camp Davis, which I've actually mentioned just a few moments ago. Other displaced African-American communities in the South included Harris Neck, which was located 50 miles south of Savannah, Childersburg, Alabama, and Midway, Florida. Communities that became the location of a camp or military training base saw two phases of robust growth. First involved kind of the private contractors that constructed the camps, and the second involved the occupation of the camps by military personnel. And as you can see with Camp Crowder, you had thousands is a good word, that came into the area to work for the private contractors. And that put increasing demands for housing. Many of those individuals lived in cars, tents, and even in one Louisiana community, you had these workers that were constructing these camps living in jail cells. And then you have the military folks coming and interacting with the community. And these definitely provided critical work for those who struggled during the Great Depression. But some of the displacement is part of the story that we haven't really heard before. Soldiers spent their payroll at local businesses, retail stores, and in some cases, local brothels, despite efforts by some communities to provide oversight. The bases employed various civilians, and historian Hutchinson noted at the height of the war, a single base could employ more labor in a community than all other labor sectors combined. One of the other kind of long-term impacts, which we've talked about, is the economic benefit. But in terms of the impact on race relations, it was certainly significant. Over 1 million Black men and women served in the military during World War II, and they faced segregated facilities. Hutchinson wrote, quote, instead of a unified area of barracks, mess halls, recreation centers, and chapels, military bases often possess two districts with separate facilities reserved for white and Black personnel. Even when the facilities were separate, they were oftentimes unequal. For example, at MacDill Army Airfield near Tampa, Florida, white soldiers lived in barracks while the Black soldiers lived in tents. And African-American service members could experience, and certainly did experience, violence both on and off military bases in the South and throughout the war. Establishing military installations during World War II across the United States left a lasting economic, racial, and post-World War II legacy. They initially brought much-needed jobs, like in the South, but across the United States, to people who were struggling to get out of the Great Depression. And some of those folks did experience economic windfalls. The segregated experiences, particularly for Black soldiers that they faced, fueled a civil rights movements that stretched into the 1950s and 60s. While some military installations closed immediately after the Second World War, many of the installations continued into the Cold War and post-Cold War era, and they continue to provide an important economic windfall and military training, and important to the nation's defense today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Taylor. That was a great presentation. While folks are thinking about their questions for you, one question I had is, what would your advice be for anyone who is considering a nomination based on this criteria on where they would start their research?
I mean, just in terms of, so if you look at the United States Army, which was the most prevalent, I mean, you could definitely look for those installations in your area. You could most definitely look at the defense manufacturing that was present in your communities. And those critical resources that I mentioned are still the ones that I used to kind of develop this presentation. And there's definitely other resources, but those are the ones that, and these are written by the United States Navy, the United States Army historians, and they do a very fine job of getting at some of the granular details, which is, to me, it's the most important, it's the hardest thing to find. And so then so if you do find an installation or a facility, my other go-to would probably be looking at newspapers.com and typing in to see what the local spin on these installations are. And, like I can do that with Fort Leonard Wood, with Camp Crowder. And they give you, kind of a sense of, they will give you more granular details, like the 70 million board feet for Fort Leonard Wood. That was out of one of those articles. I mean, it's they really can give some specific details, and they also cover the impact. They will say these farmers or this organization decided to sue the federal government, or they're protesting what the federal government wants to give them for their compensation for their land. So you can find a little bit of the conflict that's going on there. And you can, I mean, what we haven't really talked about is, these contractors, both military and civilian, are dealing with labor issues. And so that's usually also another hot button topic that quickly comes to the forefront. When you're looking at the newspapers, you can really see that. Because I mean, it is thousands of workers. Just, it just reminds me of a kind of like a wasp nest, or, a hornet. They're all kind of converging onto the, where the construction is, or what's hot at the moment. And it does really, it creates tension quick. And I think in a way that, again, we just really don't have, we don't have bases really necessarily being established, or war industry. You don't really think about those kinds of things, but it gets really complicated quick.
Yeah, thank you. And that ties really nicely to a question in the chat from Kathleen Madigan, which is, how are communities affected economically when bases were closed after the war?
Yeah, I mean, that's another kind of, some obviously continue on. And so if they continue on with the post-Cold War defense, which happens relatively quickly with the Korean War in some places. But that is a definite challenge that a lot of these communities have. So for what happened in Camp Crowder, so a lot of the buildings were sold off. I read one article where I think it was part of the theater at Camp Crowder made it to Kansas City. And they they rebuilt it, took it apart, and then assembled it in Kansas City. And And so there's a whole cottage industry of um, surplus property, which historians have done a little bit of work with, kind of tracing, how that works, and really the development of the kind of military industrial complex to a certain extent. But some of it's sold off to private businesses, but it was constructed by government funds. The other thing that does happen, at least with the Navy, because the Navy was so pressed with some of their resources, they actually acquire some of the Army bases or installations. So you have some of that goes on. But yes, and so Camp Crowder today is Missouri National Guard has a presence there in some of the facilities, but most of the camp is pretty much gone today. Fort Leonard Wood is thriving. I mean, it's still chemical engineers, all kinds of engineering are based out of Fort Leonard Wood today.
Thank you. And while we give folks a chance to pop any other questions that they might have into the chat, or to raise their hand if you would like to ask it directly, I'll let you have a few minutes to follow up on some of the conversation that we had during your presentation on Monday this week.
So yes, so there were questions about how various minority groups use discrimination they faced in the military and defense industry, and how did they channel that into push for civil rights in the post-World War II period. There are a number of books, but some recent work by Sandra Bolzinius, Glory in Their Spirit. And she looks at how four African-American women who were part of WWII went on strike to protest their unfair treatment at Fort Devens. And they were later court-martialed. And so she talks about how they channeled that into calling attention to the discrimination that they faced. And another kind of important work, among others, but Elizabeth Escobedo's From Coveralls to Zoot Suits, Lives of Mexican American Women on the World War II Homefront. And so she looks at Mexican American women who were involved in war industry in California, and how they joined various organizations to many of them were, as soon as it seems like individuals of color and women, they were in many ways the first ones to be let go in some of these defense industries. And so this begins certainly by 44 and 45, where there's just kind of there's just not as much of a need for various things. And so they are some of the first to go. And a couple of those individuals use the FEPC, Fair Employment Practices Committee, that had been established for workers during the war to have their grievances concerned or heard before that body, the FEPC. And she talks about their role. A couple of other books which are really important. These are very new. Matthew Delmont's book and Thomas Guglielmo, Divisions, The New History of Racism and Resistance, but Delmont's book on Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad. So these are really two books that are right off the press. My graduate colloquium is reading Divisions, and also reading Escobedo's book, among others, this semester. And then we had one other question about the transition from the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps which didn't grant women military status, transitioning to the Women's Army Corps in 1943. And I was asked a question about the politics that went down in Congress about that. And Lisa Meyer has written a book, Creating G.I. Jane, which talks about the really gendered dynamics that were going on the floor of Congress at the time. They were debating this as to whether or not women should be granted military status, and so she captures some of that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we are just at 2 o'clock now. We do have one more question. So if folks want to stick around for that. John, do you have a little bit more time to stick around?
I do.
That? Okay, wonderful. Kathleen Madigan asks, did you find that many of the temporary buildings on World War II era bases, both currently active or closed, still exist today and are being used either by military or local communities?
So there's the Fort Leonard Wood, the Black Officers Center. I mean, that one is still in use. The one book that essentially looked at the 700 series and the 800 series buildings that the Army used for their installations, for their kind of barracks. They conducted their survey in the 1990s, 1995, and there were still several buildings that were in existence at the time. Now, whether or not they're still there, I don't know. I mean, it's going to vary, and I don't have a Habs Hair. I'm not sure I don't know if they've done any follow-ups to that or not. I haven't seen any, but there could definitely be something that's there. It might be in the gray literature, which sometimes we don't see. But yeah, Habs Hair or the National Park Service, they may have a better ear as to if there's been some more recent studies done.
Yeah, and as part of one of the other cooperative agreement projects that the National Council on Public History is engaged with is an update of the initial World War II Homefront theme study. And part of that is revisiting the properties study list from that report and generating a new one, and hopefully generating a couple of additional nominations as well. So if anyone has thoughts or ideas on that, my email is in the chat, and I'm sure Matt Basso from the University of Utah, who is leading that project, would welcome any gems that he might follow up on there. Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Taylor. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for an hour on your Friday afternoon. I hope that maybe this is the beginning of the weekend for you. And I want to remind everyone that we have one more in this series of presentations on Wednesday of next week, September 27th at 1 p.m. Eastern. We will be hearing from Erica Fugger on the Criterion 9, achievements by a city and its environs to preserve the heritage and legacy of the city's contributions to the war effort and to preserve World War II history. So I hope we'll see some of you there. And following Erica's presentation, probably on Thursday or Friday of next week, we will follow up with links to the recordings of all of these presentations. So thank you all again so much. Thank you again, Dr. Taylor, and I hope you all have a lovely weekend.
Thanks. Bye-bye.